Well, good morning, everyone. The May 3rd, 2021 meeting of the Joint Legislative Audit Review Commission will now come to order. I welcome you all. Any kind of luck, my friends, this week, spring may arrive and stay with us for a while, but welcome to our meeting this morning. We have a full agenda as usual, and I would remind members that if you would mute yourselves, you'll get rid of some of that extraneous crinkling noises we hear in the background. So take a look at whether you're muted or not and make sure that you are muted. And if you want to get my attention, Nathan, we have the raise hand feature on this, do we not? Members can raise their hand. And if you do not, there you go.
That's correct, yes.
Arnold's got the idea. We'll make sure that you get recognized. We also, you will recall in our meetings that our staff is real good about taking breaks of times to appropriately ask questions rather than break the flow of the presentation. So we'd abide with that. I'd be appreciative. So with those background comments for our meeting, I would ask our director, Hal Greer, to give us an overview of the agenda and our work for today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Madam Vice Chair, and members of the Commission. Welcome to the first JLARC Commission meeting of 2021. As Chairman Plum said, I'm Hal Greer, the Staff Director. Before we get started, I'd like to turn it over to Nathan to just briefly run over meeting logistics. You've already touched on, Mr. Chairman, but we'll turn over to Nathan for just a few more comments on that.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Nathan Scressett. I'm the JLARC staff, and I'll be facilitating the technical side of today's meeting. So I'm having a little trouble getting the YouTube to engage, so I'll keep working on that as we continue. We have several tiers of participants for this meeting. As you all may remember, we haven't done this in a while. Everyone here is a full panelist. As such, you can share full video and audio. I don't believe we have any participant level, attendee level participants in this meeting. Everyone else should be able to view the public live stream once I get it going. And okay, sorry, we had a few late joiners. As you may have noticed, when you join the meeting, your audio is automatically placed on mute, as the chairman mentioned. Please do mute your mics. If you happen to forget, I can do that remotely. During the presentations, our presenters will pause periodically to invite questions. Please ask the chair to be recognized in order to ask your question or make your comment. We have one call-in participant. So if they would like to ask a question, we ask that you please identify yourself before speaking so that we can all tell who you are. And finally, if you have any technical issues or need help, please contact our staff and we'll try and get those resolved. Before I turn it back over to Hal, I believe we should probably do our roll call.
Yeah, please do.
All right. Do we have Delegate Austin?
Present.
Thank you. Delegate Carr?
Present.
Speaker Fillicorn?
Present.
Delegate Cox?
He's present.
I believe I did see him. Leader Herring?
Present.
Senator Howell?
Here.
Senator Locke?
Here.
Senator Norman?
Here.
Senator McPike?
Here.
Delegate Orrock?
Present.
Thank you. Delegate Plum? Yes,
Here.
Delegate Sickles?
Here.
Senator Spruill?
Here.
Delegate Torian?
Here.
All right. I believe that is everyone.
Thank you, Nathan. Mr. Chairman, we have 3 items on the agenda this morning. First, we'll present our biennial report on JLARC impacts. Next, we'll present the JLARC work plan for the 2021 calendar year. And then finally, the Auditor of Public Accounts and her staff will present their work plan for the coming fiscal year, as well as results from some of their work from the prior year. Mr. Chairman, before we begin with our agenda, I would like to introduce the newest members of our staff. They're Rhonda Newsom and Landon Weber, who both started in February. Rhonda came to us from the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services, where she has been a program data analyst responding to legislative inquiries and the lead analyst for several major initiatives, including STEP Virginia. Prior to her time at DBHDS, Rhonda was a senior policy analyst for DMAS for 15 years. At DMAS, she had a wide range of responsibilities, including serving as the director of the Office of Data Analytics. Rhonda also worked for the Social Security Administration for 4 years as an economic research analyst. She has a master's in public policy from William & Mary and a BA from VCU. Rhonda has been assigned to the housing study. Also joining us is Landon Weber, who came to us from the Virginia Economic Development Partnership, where he was a manager and analyst in the Economic Competitiveness Division. Prior to his time at VEDP, he was a senior analyst at the Louisiana Economic Development Agency. Landon has done research for the Brookings Institution and Shelby County Schools in Tennessee. Landon earned a BA from Rhodes College and will complete his master's in public policy at UVA's Baton School this month. Landon has been assigned to the VEC study. Now to the first item, Mr. Chairman. The first item on our agenda is our biennial report to the General Assembly entitled JLARC Impacts. You should have received a copy of that in your materials. We're required by statute to report at least once every biennium on actions taken in response to prior reports and recommendations, and to bring to your attention matters that may require follow-up. Most of the report is devoted to an update on actions taken by the General Assembly and agencies over the last 2 years to implement JLARC recommendations. The report also shows the savings that have been achieved in the last 2 fiscal years as a result of recommendations. And the report highlights further actions that are still needed to implement key recommendations. In assessing how well JLARC is doing with impact and cost savings, JLARC staff maintain performance measures that we present every 2 years as part of this report. I'd like to first share our performance on a few of the key measures. Then today, most of the presentation will highlight legislative actions taken by the General Assembly during the 2021 sessions to implement JLARC recommendations. So now the performance measures. Slide 3 shows the key performance measure for assessing impact. It indicates the percentage of recommendations implemented from reports published over the last 4 years. As you can see, follow-through on implementation of recommendations, especially legislative follow-through, has been outstanding over the last 4 years. Of the more than 400 recommendations that we've issued over that time period, more than 3/4 have been at least partially implemented, and the vast majority have been fully implemented. I'd like to report on one other statistic. We issued 87 recommendations in 2020 that were directed to the General Assembly. During the 2021 sessions, about 80% of those recommendations were implemented through legislation or the budget. I want to recognize Chairman Plum's leadership and attention to follow through on recommendations, as well as the many other leaders on this commission who were instrumental in the passage of the legislation that implemented these recommendations. Mr. Chairman, another key performance measure is the amount of cost savings that result from JLARC recommendations. Estimated fiscal year 2019 and 2020 savings are due to reforms to Virginia's Medicaid program related to recommendations from JLARC's 2016 report on managing spending in Medicaid. Virginia saved $5.5 million in FY19 because MCOs returned a portion of their underwriting gains or profits to the state. And the state saved $6 million in FY20 because the state reduced the rates paid in MCOs to reflect inefficient spending. Although the 2016 report was published prior to the timeframe covered by this JLARC impacts report, the savings are reflected here because it's the first time these particular savings have accrued to the state since the recommendations were implemented. The state also experienced savings in FY20 from the return of profits, but accurate estimates were not available at the time this report was printed. A final performance measure that I'll briefly mention is legislation introduced based on JLARC recommendations. During 2020 and 2021, a total of 82 bills and 49 budget amendments were introduced. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to turn it over to our associate directors to briefly highlight the legislation the General Assembly passed in 2021 to implement JLARC recommendations. First up is Senior Associate Director Justin Brown. Justin?
Thanks, Al.
Hey, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Who is?
This is Kirk, and maybe this has been corrected, but I'm getting a lot of text that the streaming's not working. Maybe it's been corrected, but
Yeah, sorry about that. We just got it up.
okay. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank y'all, because I was having trouble getting on myself. So thank you.
I apologize for that.
Don't worry.
Thank you for letting us know. I'm glad people want to watch. That's great. As Hal said, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on some of the major impacts from the last legislative session. And I'm sure remember you asked us to review how, not whether, but how Virginia could go about legalizing marijuana if that was the will of the legislature. And the two bills that ended up passing to legalize marijuana, including Leader Herring's HB 2312, heavily reflected much of what we laid out in our report. In fact, the final bill is signed by the governor and enacted by you a few weeks ago, fully or partially incorporated 60 of our report's recommendations or options. The bill legalizes possession of small amounts and the cultivation of a few plants, but only for people over 21. The bill has a lot of public safety restrictions and provisions, as you can see on the slide, things like restrictions on advertising and packaging to make sure they are not appealing or accessible to kids. In fact, the final bill dedicates 30% of all tax revenues collected to a variety of different public health purposes, including funds to CSBs and public awareness campaigns. If we go to the next slide, you might remember you also created a new agency to regulate commercial sales. And that'll be an independent agency that reports to a board. You can see that the legislation set the retail sales tax at 21% and gives localities where sales occur the option to add another 3%. If we go to the next slide, a big focus of the resolution directing our review was to propose some programs to redress the prior negative impact of disproportionate enforcement of marijuana laws. The final bill starts the process of expunging marijuana offenses and tasks the new regulatory agency with developing social equity criteria to evaluate and award licenses. The bill also creates a loan fund to help social equity applicants get started and a reinvestment fund that will get 30% of all tax revenue and make awards to people in communities harmed by disproportionate enforcement in the past. Lastly, I just note that the bill included a clause requiring us to compare the final bill to our report. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of similarity, but I think we will give that comparison to you at next month's meeting, the June meeting. So there was also quite a bit of legislative follow through on our review of SBSD, and a big focus was on improving the financing authority, with several bills being enacted to provide more transparency and structure to the lending process. There was also a change in the requirements to the board to ensure that the majority of members have experience with lending to small businesses. And SBSD itself has already started to move out on some of the improvements needed, including some things related to better guidance for staff about how to think about risk. If we go to the next slide, I'd also note that Leader Herring introduced a budget amendment requiring SBSD to figure out how to either improve the Business One Stop website or just eliminate it altogether. You might remember we had a few reviews last year related to K-12, and one of those specifically looked at the DOE central office. And Chairman Plum carried a variety of budget amendments, including 3 related to that study's recommendations. One of those requires DOE to try a pilot program on changing the very long-standing tradition of light or frankly non-existent oversight of local school divisions. The idea here is to focus on a few key areas of compliance and try doing a little more to make sure that what is supposed to be happening at the local level is actually happening. Another amendment requires DOE to take its work with low-performing schools to the next level. The state program has historically not been very effective, and Virginia had far fewer staff devoted to this important function than other states. So the amendment directs an improvement plan to be submitted back to the legislature. There's also some follow through on our recommendations related to improving teacher recruiting and retention, and that kind of crosswalked to our review of special education. And speaking of that, I will turn it over to Tracy to talk about impact there.
Thanks, Justin. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members. There were 2 studies under my supervision last year, and there was really impressive legislative follow through on both of them. The first is our study of K-12 special education. The General Assembly passed a bill patroned by Delegate Carr that implemented 24 of 27 of the recommendations out of that report, which was really just very gratifying and thrilling for us and the team and all of the research that was done on that study. The reforms put into law will improve determinations of eligibility for special education services. They'll improve school divisions' ability to develop quality individualized education programs, or IEPs, for students that have disabilities. And the reforms will also improve VDOE's oversight of the delivery of special education services. In addition, the Applied Studies Diploma, which many students with disabilities earn, will be informed by an actual curriculum. General education teachers and school administrators will receive required training on educating students with disabilities. And VDOE will be required to take concrete steps to address the special education teacher shortage. Mr. Chairman, VDOE has already implemented at least one of that study's recommendations by issuing a superintendent's memo to school divisions on the inclusion of students with disabilities. On the next slide, the second study under my supervision also had impressive follow through from the General Assembly, including yourself, Mr. Chairman, and that was our study of the Children's Services Act. For example, on July 1, school divisions will be able to use CSA funds to help transition eligible students out of private special education day schools and back to their public school. Legislation also creates a work group that will review our recommendations to transfer the administration of CSA funds for private day schools from the Office of Children's Services to VDOE, and also to allow CSA funds to be used to fund services that can prevent students from being placed out of their public school and into a private day school. So as of July 1, those CSA funds, which prior to this were not school divisions, they could not be spent within public schools. They now can be used to transition kids who have been in private day school for a while, but who've been determined to be eligible and to go back to their public school, but who can't, in many cases because of a lack of resources. Those CSA funds can now be used to help transition those kids back to public school. The other important recommendation, as I said, was for students to be able, school divisions to be able to use CSA funds to prevent private day placements in cases where it is appropriate to educate a student in public day school. And the work group is studying the best way to implement that recommendation. So that's also very gratifying for us. In addition, private day schools will be required to report their tuition to the state and also report their performance according to several new performance measures that are similar to what public schools already have to report on. And finally, Chairman Plum's bill will give additional authority to the Office of Children's Services to oversee and monitor the performance of local CSA programs. We heard repeatedly from OCS that while they would like to be more involved in local CSA programs, really the Code of Virginia did not give them the type of authority that they felt they needed to really monitor local program performance and step in when it was warranted. And this authority will give the state and OCS greater visibility into local programs so that problems can be more readily identified and addressed. And OCS has already taken steps to implement recommendations directed to them in our report to collect performance staffing and funding data from those local CSA programs. So, Mr. Chairman, that's the impact from the two studies that I supervised last year, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Otherwise, I can turn it over to Kimberly Sarte.
Questions at this point? Okay, let's move forward.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's also been some good legislative follow through and impact on the state's economic development incentives. In response to a review we conducted of the state's data center sales tax exemption, Senator McPike and Delegate Moorfield sponsored legislation that modifies the exemption to encourage data center growth in distressed localities. And this is important because most of the state's current data centers are located in Northern Virginia. The legislation also added reporting requirements such as employment and capital investment for data centers claiming the exemption. And this again is important because it is the largest incentive offered by the state, but we don't know its full costs and benefits because not all data centers using it are required to provide information. Senator McPike and Delegate Hudson also sponsored legislation to eliminate the state's 2 coal tax credits. These are among the state's largest tax credits, but they actually generate economic losses for the state and are no longer relevant to the purposes for which they were adopted. And the coal tax credits will sunset after this year. Senator McPike also sponsored legislation to strengthen the project selection criteria for the Economic Development Access Program, which provides grants for road access to industrial sites. There's also been some good impact on VITA, which JLARC reviewed in both 2019 and 2020. The Appropriation Act now requires VITA to provide an annual report on the adequacy of the state's network infrastructure, including any upgrades that are needed. And this will be very helpful to agencies because, as you can imagine, the network is of critical importance to agencies being able to conduct their business. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge that VITA has either fully or partially implemented all recommendations from our 2019 review of their new service model. And these recommendations address important items such as contract management, the resolution of service issues, and agency billing. Mr. Chairman, this concludes our presentation of the recent actions and follow-through taken on JLARC's report recommendations. We are happy to take any questions at this time. And if there are none, Hal will be up next to discuss the agency work plan.
Okay, commission members, do you have questions? Hearing none, then back to Hal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next item on the agenda is a presentation of the JLARC work plan for this year.
Hal, let me interrupt you just for
Sure.
one as we were transitioning. I wanted to commend the staff on what's obviously been very excellent reports, substantive and meaningful, that have now been translated into making government better for the people of Virginia. That's what our work is about, and seeing us go full circle is really quite reassuring. So thank you for the strong support that you give to the legislature and to the good members of the commission and the House and the Senate who passed those into law to improve our services to the Commonwealth. So again, thank you all. Now, Hal, that's the winding up a little bit to look at the past. We move on now to looking at the future.
That's right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's indeed what the work plan does, is look at this year's work. And for those of you who are relatively new to JLARC, it's been a typical practice to present the work plan in May at the May meeting of JLARC each year to give you as commission members a better sense of the work that we're undertaking in the current year from the studies that you've directed. This meeting also serves as an opportunity for you to provide input on issues that you believe are especially important to address in conducting our research on the topics that you've assigned to us this year. Each of the associate directors will now give you an overview of the work under their oversight that we are conducting, and we'll welcome your questions or thoughts regarding any of this work that we're undertaking. We also have the project leaders of each of these studies on hand to assist with answering questions that you may have. With that, I'll turn it over to Justin, who will lead us off. Justin?
Thank you, Hal. Good morning again. I've got 3 studies that I'm supervising this year. You can see those on the slide. And if we go to the next slide, I'll start with transportation. This was a resolution originally introduced in the House by Delegate Austin, then selected for us by the JLARC Study Subcommittee last year. We plan to complete this in November, and you can see it's being led by one of our project leaders, Mark Ribbon. If we go to the next slide, you can see the mandate points us to the current condition of the state's highways and other major transportation infrastructure. Also to look at several aspects of vehicle technology and potential changes in driving patterns that may affect transportation needs and revenue over the long term. If you go to the next slide, it just shows you the major transportation infrastructure. Our focus will be on surface transportation. So it's primarily roads, bridges, public transit, and what are called special structures, things like tunnels through mountains. There's a lot of players in the transportation space at all levels of government. Obviously, the Commonwealth Transportation Board is the major state-level decision-making body. This fiscal year, it looks like transportation revenues will come in at about $7.8 billion. If we go to the next slide, just wanted to mention it's going to be a little interesting or challenging for us on this study in some respects because you made some pretty substantial changes to transportation revenue during the 2020 session. Those are just beginning to take hold. And obviously the pandemic temporarily created some revenue issues, but it does look like the state is already frankly past those pandemic revenue challenges. And so that at this point seems like a one-time issue. Go to the next slide. Our study issues for this are going to pretty closely track the mandate, focusing on the condition and performance of the surface transportation infrastructure. Also looking at how well prepared the system is to adapt to changes over time. And that really gets into how effectively the state identifies and plans to meet transportation needs. We're going to do some projections of how revenues might be affected over the long term. That really gets into how, particularly as the trend towards more fuel efficient and electric cars continues to depress that base of available gas consumption that can be used for taxation. There's some movement in other states on something called a mileage-based user fee, which would charge based on miles driven. So we're going to learn more about that as a potential option to consider at some point out in the future. DMV is already doing some research in this area. And actually that 2020 legislative change kind of set the framework for something similar to this. If we go to the next slide, this just shows you how we're going to go about our work. A lot of interviews of state, regional, and local officials, industry experts. We're going to do a pretty detailed comparison of Virginia's and other states' needs and how the different states go about planning and producing revenue, and then the revenue projections that I mentioned a moment ago. I will pause here for a second in case any members have questions or comments or suggestions about our planned transportation study.
Questions of Jason? This is a mighty big, important study, so we look forward to your results. I don't know if you get into what turns out to be the ultimate mix of transportation, mass transit versus car and so on. That's something that will affect us in the long run, but we look forward to the results of your study.
Absolutely, and that kind of how you think about preparing, particularly in different regions of the state with respect to rail and transit versus highway. That's definitely something we're going to take a look at.
Good.
So the next study, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
The next study I'd like to talk to you about is a review of the juvenile justice system in Virginia. And you directed us last fall to review the juvenile justice system. We are planning to finalize and release that report at our December meeting. You can see the staff on the slide there. It's being led by another of our project leaders, Drew Dickinson. Go to the next slide, just as a reminder, you can see the specific topics included in that resolution. And it was fairly comprehensive the way it was laid out. A few things I'd emphasize. We're going to see how that recent system transformation has affected the process and the outcomes for juveniles that are in the system. I'd also point out that we were asked specifically to look into facility locations and size, especially as it relates to where the child's family is located and the educational requirements and resultant costs. If you go to the next slide, it's interesting. The statutory direction for this system is to strike a balance between public safety, obviously, but also really rehabilitating juvenile offenders. The law really emphasizes diversion from the system altogether when possible. And that statutory direction, as well as what kind of modern best practice suggests, makes it pretty clear that removing a juvenile from their home and placing them in a facility is really kind of the last resort. The system collectively costs about $230 million per year, and nearly all of that is state general funds. So if we go to the next slide, just to give you a little sense of the scale of the system. So in a typical year, there might be about 40,000 complaints made against youth in the state. A really big portion of those complaints are either dismissed from the get-go, and then for the ones that are founded, a lot of those are actually ended up kind of kids being diverted outside of the system, and particularly if it's one of their first interactions, that they don't have any more participation in the system. And what that pie chart there shows you is, last year there were about 3,300 kids that were kind of involved in the system formally, and you can see 69% of those ended up being on probation. And then, much smaller numbers actually ended up in the direct care facility, the state facility, either Bon Air, or there's local and regional juvenile detention centers located all around the state. 14% of the kids ended up there for some period of time. So in terms of what we're going to look at the system outcomes, again, kind of pre and post transformation. We're also going to review what are called the conditions of confinement in the state and local regional juvenile detention centers. And I alluded to this, but our review is really going to take a look at the educational and facility costs of the current system and seek to find maybe some ways to reduce those costs. And I recall this notion of where a facility should be located and how close it should be quickly to youth's families was something that I believe Senator Locke was interested in. I know Senator Marsden is also very focused on this in kind of his Senate finance role. We're also going to take a look at the process and services related to probation and diversion. If we go to the next slide, in terms of what we're going to actually do, we're going to compare Virginia's processes and facilities to kind of the best practices in the juvenile justice space. We'll also calculate those educational and facilities costs and take a look at the geographic location of the facilities. We're also working with DJJ to administer a survey to juveniles currently in the Bon Air facility. It's a little tricky to pull off, but we think we can do it. We're also going to have an online feedback form for families of court-involved youth. We're also going to survey the state staff and then the local and regional staff who run each of those local and regional facilities. I will pause here in case members have any questions or suggestions for other topics for us to focus on as part of our review of juvenile justice.
Questions or comments on juvenile justice? All right, let's move ahead.
The last one for me this year is our review of the progressivity of the state's individual income tax. And this is something that we're going to start this year and give you an update on at the September meeting, but we're not going to finish it and release a final report until next year. Go to the next slide. You can see through a joint resolution, you asked us to identify potential ways Virginia's individual income tax system could be made more progressive. We fully realize this can be a bit of a hot button issue, so I want to emphasize that we'll produce an assessment of that kind of describes how progressive our current system is, and then we will propose a handful of ways you could consider changing the system to make it more progressive if that ends up being the will of the legislature. We just pulled some simple statistics here to just give you a little background. You can see that the individual income tax is by far the largest single contributor to general fund revenue. It makes up about 70% in recent years. You can also see in those sub-bullets that there's a lot of things that kind of go into this notion of progressivity, but a couple of data points, those filers reporting more than 100,000 in income contributed more than half of all revenue collected, while filers reporting less than $25,000 in income collectively contributed about 5% of all revenue. We are just getting started on this, so I don't have too much more to say, but you can see we'll look at other states and we're going to coordinate very closely with tax on doing some modeling based on how changes would affect revenue and progressivity. And as I mentioned, we're going to plan to give you a bit of a status report in September in terms of some long-term revenue trends and maybe some thinking about kind of the different definitions of what tax progressivity is, so that maybe we can get some thoughts from you on that in September. I will pause here before I turn it over to Tracy in case there's any questions about this or specific parts of the individual income tax system that members want us to be particularly aware of or pay attention to as we move out on this.
Questions or comments on the tax progressivity? Hearing none, Tracy, we'll turn to you. Oh, excuse me, Senator Howe. Unmute yourself.
Thank you. Also, we're going to be having on a similar topic on progressivity, a joint legislative subcommittee working on it. And I'm hoping and I'm assuming that there will be a lot of interaction between the JLARC staff and the Senate Appropriations and Finance and House Appropriations and Finance on this. I think at the end of 2 years, I would hope that we will be in a really good position to make some, if needed, major changes.
Absolutely. I've already touched base with Ann and April about that. It was kind of a little bit after the session, and I know they're kind of planning for that effort, but we are aware of that, and absolutely we'll kind of coordinate. And I think, as you said, the idea is to have kind of multiple pieces of information to make some decisions on down the road. So absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tracy?
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, members, as Justin did with the studies under his supervision this year, I'll give you an overview of these three. We'll talk about the research issues and the research activities for these 3 studies, which are under my supervision. First up is our study of Virginia's guardian and conservator system, which is being led by Joe McMahon. The study resolution requires JLARC staff to assess Virginia's oversight of the public guardian and conservator system, and also to examine what requirements and standards should be followed in both the public and the private systems to ensure that the personal and financial affairs of Virginians who are under guardianship or conservatorship are appropriately managed. Just by way of background, circuit court judges appoint guardians and conservators, for incapacitated and or indigent adults. Guardians make decisions regarding these adults' personal affairs, such as where they reside or receive medical care, and conservators manage these adults' financial affairs. When an adult is placed under guardianship or conservatorship, it's important to understand that some or all of their rights are removed. Petitions for guardianship or conservatorship can be filed with the circuit court by family members, friends, or institutions such as hospitals. And when a petition is filed, the court evaluates the justification for the petition, and if it finds that there is justification, appoints an individual to be the guardian or the conservator. Adult Protective Services is the system for identifying and addressing the abuse, neglect, or exploitation of adults, and a review of APS, especially as it relates to individuals who are under guardianship, is included in our study. An important aspect of Virginia's system is the distinction between the public system and the private system. The public system is overseen centrally by the Department for the Aging and Rehabilitative Services, and DARS contracts with 13 different provider organizations to provide guardians for indigent adults. The public system received just over $4 million in state funding this fiscal year, and that supports a little over 1,000 public guardian slots. State law establishes a maximum client to guardian ratio of 20 clients for every guardian. In contrast, there is no central entity designated to oversee the provision of private guardianships, nor is there a maximum client to guardian ratio in the private system. There's also no public funding for the system. Instead, the costs of guardianship are paid for out of the adult client's assets. Mr. Chairman, the study issues that Joe and his team will be focusing on are listed here. The team plans to identify the characteristics and living arrangements of Virginians under guardianship and conservatorship, and to understand what individuals or entities are serving as guardians. The team will also evaluate whether circuit courts prioritize the best interests of incapacitated adults when considering whether to place an adult under guardianship or conservatorship, such as fully considering alternatives to guardianship, and evaluating whether the individual who is selected to serve as a guardian is well-intentioned or whether they may present a conflict of interest. The team will also evaluate the oversight and funding of conservatorship and the public guardianship program, and also determine how the private guardianship system could be better overseen. Finally, the team will evaluate whether the state's APS system adequately prevents and addresses abuse, neglect, and exploitation, especially for adults who are under guardianship or conservatorship. The team's research activities will include an analysis of data from DARS, as well as civil and criminal court data, to quantify the number of individuals who are under guardianship and to summarize their circumstances. The team will also review court case files and the annual reports that each guardian is required to file with local departments of social services. We're also going to be interviewing and surveying numerous stakeholders and reviewing other state systems so that we can better understand other states' policies and practices. And I would be happy to take any questions about our study of this system. I'll pause for just a minute. If there are no questions, then next up is our study of the Virginia Employment Commission, which is being led by Lauren Excel. Let's see. The study resolution passed by the commission last fall directs staff to focus on the 5 topics that are listed here. Our priorities in this study are the first 3 topics, which essentially boil down to VEC's response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the unprecedented demand for unemployment insurance benefits. On this slide, I'll give you a little background on VEC and then move through 3 slides that describe where things stand at the agency as of the end of March. Of course, VEC is the state agency responsible for administering unemployment insurance benefits. And prior to 2020, individuals who were determined to be eligible for unemployment could receive up to $378 per week for up to 26 weeks. Last year, as you know, the federal government significantly expanded eligibility for these benefits and has increased their amount and duration. In terms of funding, unemployment benefits are paid for out of the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund, and this fund is managed by VEC and funded through employer taxes. Historically, VEC has not received any general fund appropriations. Mr. Chairman, in the next 3 slides, I'll give you a brief update of where things stand with VEC's processing of unemployment insurance claims and its responsiveness to customers. First, I'll highlight some of the biggest impacts of the pandemic on VEC. The number of UI claims submitted to VEC in 2020 exceeded those submitted in the prior year by at least a factor of 10. This caused the depletion of the UI Trust Fund, which triggered a federal government loan to VEC. In the spring of 2020, as the pandemic unfolded, VEC determined that the modernization of its IT system should be put on hold so that it could devote its internal IT staff resources to responding to the demands of the pandemic on its legacy mainframe system. The final phase of the project, which is benefits processing, was scheduled to go live in 2020, several years after the initial projected completion date. Relying on the mainframe system for this enormous volume of claims meant that claimants could not track the status of their claims and could not submit documentation electronically. This significantly contributed to the volume of customer calls to VEC and to its backlogs because it had to devote time and personnel to answering questions about the status of claims and also processing volumes of paper-based applications. It also appears that not having a well-functioning IT system significantly complicated the implementation of the federal government's new UI programs, further causing delays and contributing to backlogs. VEC has told us that the IT modernization project was resumed last month. And as you may know, VEC closed most of its field offices, and this further reduced its ability to interact with and assist customers. It is my understanding that the field offices are scheduled to reopen in June. While VEC's new UI claims have decreased by about half since the peak in March 2020, their claims processing has not improved based on key performance metrics tracked by the Department of Labor. While many claims are straightforward and can be processed quickly, there are 2 scenarios that require more time and review by VEC staff. One is for claims that require further review by staff because of some issue with the application or disagreement over the circumstances with the employee separation. These are claims that require what VEC refers to as adjudication. As of March 31, VEC was processing just over 2% of these claims within the expected 21 days, and the Department of Labor ranked VEC last in the country on this metric. This was even slower than the 4% that the Department of Labor reported in the fall of 2020. And then there are the claims that are under appeal. The average age of an appeal at the first level is currently 247 days. In some cases, claimants going through the appeals process are receiving their UI payments, but in many cases, they're not. The most recent data we have on claims backlogs are as of March 31. At that time, 612,000 claims were awaiting information from the claimant's employers, 137,000 were awaiting adjudication, and there were 45,000 appeals at the first level. Mr. Chairman, as has been reported, VEC has taken several actions to improve its performance. This March, it launched an automated phone system that will allow people to apply for their pandemic unemployment assistance benefits without having to talk to a person. And as I mentioned, VEC has resumed its IT modernization project. And between last year and this spring, it has doubled its pre-pandemic unemployment insurance staffing and also repurposed many of its existing staff to focus on claims processing. When the study is completed this fall, we will have a much fuller understanding of the effectiveness of VEC's response to the pandemic and the specific reasons why it has struggled to be more responsive to claimants. We'll also be able to report on the performance of VEC's IT modernization project, which, Mr. Chairman, just entered its 12th year. Our intention is not just to evaluate VEC's past performance and explain what, if anything, could have been done better. Rather, we expect that many of the existing challenges will persist into the fall. And our goal is to recommend steps that can be taken to overcome them for the many Virginians who are still awaiting benefits or who may unfortunately become eligible for them even into the next year. Mr. Chairman, the study issues that the team will focus on for the remainder of the study are listed here. Of course, we'll be focusing on VEC's administration of UI claims and appeals and the operations of its IT and phone systems. We'll also be evaluating VEC's management of the UI trust fund and how effectively it monitors and identifies fraudulent claims. The team will also examine the agency's structure, its staffing, and its management, including the adequacy of the administrative funding it receives from the federal government and how it spends that funding. Here are the research activities for this study, Mr. Chairman. I won't plan to go into these in the interest of time, but would be happy to answer any questions you have about our planned research.
Tracy, thank you very much for this critically important
Mr. Chairman.
report. Yes, Delegate Cox.
Yeah, Tracy, do you know, this is a good report, but our frustration, and I think it's across the board nonpartisan, is that we get people that will tell us they will call for literally a year and just never get a call back. And I can tell you, even our offices, which, generally with most agencies, if a legislator calls, we go months without getting called back. Do y'all measure that? I mean, there's one thing of measuring how long it takes to, actually respond to a call. But I think if you listen to our constituents, one of the big problems is that they just never get a call back. So is there anything to sort of measure that?
That's a really good question, Delegate Cox. And I would say, I'm going to see if Lauren Excel can maybe jump in here. She's the project leader and help me out a little bit. But I will say we have also heard those same reports. And I do know that VEC at some point fairly recently had implemented a callback feature for the calls that it receives and is unable to answer. My further understanding is that that callback feature has not consistently been available. Lauren, is that accurate? Can you correct me on that if I'm wrong?
Yes, we are still trying to understand the circumstances when it hasn't been, but that's our understanding, that it has not been fully available at all times.
And so, Delegate Cox, to further answer your question, the team certainly is measuring all that it can measure with respect to dropped calls, callbacks, how long it takes clients to receive responses, all of trying to really measure and be able to report to you all in a quantifiable way a lot of the anecdotal reports that you are hearing from your constituents and in the media.
Thanks, Tracy. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Delegate Austin.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Tracy, in regard to what Delegate Cox said, I think the vaccination process or procedures that we were using, we've sort of relegated that responsibility over to some people with VDOT who've integrated a process that they use for snow removal in the state. And I think and that's a call center that we set up. And I think when that was put in place, we were able to access more people for vaccinations. So you may want to look at, Tracy, how what has happened with that process. And I think if that process were implemented with VEC in regard to callbacks, as Delegate Cox said, it may be very favorable. Certainly the magnitude of this is overwhelming. We've never experienced any claims of this magnitude and nature. So it's hard to be critical of VEC given those circumstances, but I think take a look, if you would, at how we've administered the process of callbacks through the vaccination process, if you would, please.
We certainly will do that. And I think, whether we're talking about unemployment insurance or the vaccination program, state government has really had to be creative over the past year, 18 months. And so I think that is also necessary at VEC, and we will certainly make a note to look at that program. It sounds, potentially effective and creative, and I think it's something that we can report back to you on in the fall.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator McPike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tracy, thank you for the initial numbers. The numbers are fairly stark. My question, Mr. Chairman, is there any way to have this report issued earlier? This is, when folks need government and they need assistance and they're not giving it, it's a fundamental failure. And, looking at 2.4% of sort of the more complicated cases being resolved, I think, share the comments earlier made in terms of many constituents having ongoing complaints, and I know we're tracking multiples every single day, and getting some of these issues resolved earlier rather than later is most desirable. So my question to you, Mr. Chairman, is whether or not the staff could, what does the timeline look like? Could this report come out earlier so we can identify some fundamental issues earlier rather than later in the fall?
Senator McPike, I would say to you, we've looked at that notion, and I would say to you that, as is the case oftentimes with our studies, that improvements occur as we uncover need. And I think you're already seeing some beginnings at VEC to try to get on top of this thing. In terms, however, of what we want to do for the long run, is we want to be able to position ourselves for the long run to be able to have a system in place that can be more responsive and resilient than this one has been. So I think the short answer is you will see improvements along the way, as you are actually, believe it or not, seeing some minor improvements just as we uncover what the needs are. And we'll see then later in the fall what those can be done for the long haul.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So there may be some interim updates.
Yes, sir. We can have interim updates, but also too, I will advise you that as is the case sometimes when we move into an agency, suddenly things start to improve. No one is certainly oblivious to what the need is. It's so overwhelming. But as we want to go forward with this, we want to respond to the immediate needs and get people an answer back. But in the long run, we want to build an institution that in the future won't get into this kind of situation again. Modernization, for example, the IT system is really critical. And that won't be able to happen really until over a period of time. But we're not going to wait for the fall for it all to happen. It'll unfold over time.
Agreed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it'd be helpful for maybe some of those interim updates to maybe do some early highlights as things are uncovered. So some of those improvements can get underway. So I appreciate your time.
Thank you, sir. Other questions or comments? Hearing none, then Tracy, you can go forward.
All right. The last study for me is a review of Virginia's affordable housing needs. This study is being led by Stephanie Patz. The study resolution broadly directs our staff to review the Commonwealth's housing needs and the state and local agencies' role in addressing them. It also directs us to evaluate the importance of available housing to state and local revenues and to the economy. As you know, housing affordability was a major concern even before the pandemic, but 2020 really did highlight how vulnerable so many citizens are to a lack of affordable quality housing. As you know, government assistance is available to help lower the cost of housing, but there is unmet demand for this assistance. One of the most familiar types of assistance is the Housing Choice Voucher Program, formerly referred to as Section 8. And there are lengthy waiting lists for these vouchers across the state. There are also government programs to help with the cost of building new affordable housing, but the rising costs of labor, land, and building materials are still a major hindrance to new affordable housing developments. And so our study will focus on the programs and assistance provided by Virginia's two housing agencies, Virginia Housing, formerly VHTA, and the Department of Housing and Community Development. Mr. Chairman, given the complexity and breadth of this topic, we are proposing to brief our findings to the Commission in two phases. In December, we plan to answer the questions that I have listed here. How many Virginia households are housing cost burdened, and how does this vary by region and demographic characteristics? What are the social, financial, and economic impacts of a lack of affordable housing? What state and local programs and initiatives are used to increase the supply of affordable housing and also to provide direct financial assistance to homeowners and renters? And how effective have those programs been? And finally, what are the barriers to expanding the supply of affordable housing, such as local zoning ordinances? Mr. Chairman, this will give the General Assembly information and recommendations for ways to strengthen Virginia's affordable housing policies and programs in December. One key contribution that we will make in this research is to understand and describe the complexity of local zoning ordinances and their role in hindering or encouraging affordable and quality housing stock. Then, Mr. Chairman, in the second phase of the study, which we will be able to start this year, we propose to evaluate the extent to which Virginia Housing, as the state's lead housing agency, is operating according to its mission to facilitate the development of affordable quality housing. Virginia Housing is an independent state authority, and while it receives no general funds, it does manage a significant amount of funding. In fiscal year 20, its fund balance was $3.6 billion, and it leverages that funding to expand the availability of affordable housing through multifamily rental units, and also to help lower the cost of purchasing a house for eligible Virginians. In June, we would report, in June of 2022, we would report on Virginia Housing's performance compared to its mission and evaluate how it has used its funding to address the state's housing needs. Our planned research activities are listed here. We plan to conduct a lot of data analysis on this study. For example, we'll analyze the housing cost burden experienced by Virginia households by region and by locality. We'll evaluate how this varies by race, income, and other factors. We'll also analyze the actual affordability of those multifamily housing units that are financed through government programs, such as the Virginia Housing Trust Fund and Virginia Housing's REACH program. And we'll evaluate the benefits of state programs to help with the purchase of single-family homes. Mr. Chairman, if the commission doesn't have any questions about the housing study, which I'd be happy to answer them if you do, I can then turn the presentation over to Kimberly Sarte.
Questions on housing? Hearing none, then we'll proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The work under my supervision includes the ongoing evaluation and oversight that JLARC provides for the General Assembly and the fiscal analysis services that we provide. So first, I will go over our ongoing oversight responsibilities. JLARC evaluates the state's economic development incentives on an ongoing basis for their effectiveness and economic impact. Ellen Miller on our staff is responsible for these evaluations, and she works closely with the Weldon Cooper Center at UVA, with whom we contract to perform the evaluations. As part of our work in this area, each year we conduct an in-depth evaluation of a subset of incentives. This year's evaluation will cover the state's international trade and transportation industry incentives, which include the common carrier sales tax exemptions for railroads, airlines, and shipping, the sales tax exemptions for railroad rolling stock and aircraft repair parts, incentives to increase cargo volume through the Port of Virginia, and incentives to increase the state's international exports. And we will be reporting the outcome of this evaluation to you in June. In December, we will provide you with our annual report that provides high-level information on the spending and performance of all of Virginia's economic development incentives. JLARC also provides ongoing oversight of 3 state agencies, which is VRS, Virginia 529, and VEDA, as well as Cardinal. And Jamie Bitts is the lead analyst providing this oversight. For VRS, each year we issue 2 reports looking at the system's investments, funding, defined contribution plans, and topics related to benefits and administration. And these reports will be provided to you in July and December. Also in July, the VRS Director and Chief Investment Officer will provide you with their annual status report. JLARC also sees the Virginia College Savings Plan, also known as Virginia 529, on an ongoing basis. As part of this oversight, every 4 years, JLARC contracts with an actuarial firm to provide an independent actuarial audit of Virginia 529's defined benefit savings program, also known as a prepaid 529 program. And you will be receiving the results of this audit at the July meeting. Also at the July meeting, the Virginia 529 CEO and Investment Director will provide you with their annual status report. JLARC also has oversight of Cardinal, which is the Commonwealth's Enterprise Resource Planning System. Cardinal is currently undergoing a very large expansion called the Human Capital Management Project, which will replace the state's legacy HR and payroll systems, among others. The project will be rolled out to state agencies and localities in 2 releases. The first release was supposed to be in March of this year. However, testing problems pushed back the go-live dates, so the first release will now be in October. More recent testing has been successful, and the overall project budget is still currently within allocated funding. JLARC staff will continue to monitor this project closely and intend to provide you with an update in November, which should be shortly after the first release. The final agency that JLARC oversees on an ongoing basis is VEDA. JLARC is currently conducting an in-depth review of VEDA's organizational structure and staffing, which is led by Jamie Bitts, and Jamie will be briefing you on the results of this review in September. The Commission passed a motion for us to conduct this review last October, and the motion directs us to focus on VEDA's organizational structure, whether VEDA is appropriately staffed, and VEDA's ability to recruit and retain qualified staff. To remind you of VEDA's roles and responsibilities, VITA provides IT infrastructure services to the Commonwealth and transitioned to a new multi-supplier model in 2018. In addition to its infrastructure services, VITA has state IT oversight responsibilities, including agency IT projects, security and risk management, and IT strategic planning. And over 260 staff and contractors at VITA carry out these various responsibilities. The study issues are listed for you here, and they basically map the motion, which I just went over with you. So moving on to the next slide, which is our research activities. I'll highlight a few. The team is in the process of surveying VITA staff. We will analyze staffing data from VITA and DHRM, and the team will compare VITA's organizational structure and staffing with industry and comparable states. JLARC will also provide some other evaluation support this year. HB 1990 from the 2021 session gave JLARC a new responsibility, which is to conduct racial and ethnic impact statements. Under this new responsibility, JLARC will estimate the impact on racial and ethnic disparities in the Commonwealth of proposed criminal justice legislation. And Mr. Chairman, a number of states and localities around the country have started conducting these types of assessments, and they have really become to be considered a best practice. JLARC will conduct these assessments at the request of the House Courts of Justice Chair and the Senate Judiciary Chair. And at least to start with, there will be a limit of up to 3 requests per chair per session. This new function will be available for the next regular session. So in the coming months, we will be developing procedures and methodologies to prepare for the session. And this fall, we will present you with specific procedures for JLARC to approve for the new function. There are 2 other areas of evaluative support JLARC will be providing this year. JLARC conducts reviews of proposed mandated health insurance benefits at the request of the Health Insurance Reform Commission. And there will be 2 mandates that will be reviewed this year. And we will also be facilitating an actuarial review of the State Employee Health Insurance Program. And this was directed by the 2020 Appropriation Act and will be conducted by the actuarial firm that is retained by JLARC. And Mr. Chairman, I will pause here if there are any questions about our ongoing oversight.
Questions of Kimberly? Hearing none, we will go forward.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, excuse me, Senator McPike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one question for the Virginia 529 plan. If the study also includes a comparison of fees and transaction fees charged for the plans offered?
As part of the actuarial audit, that will not be included, but that is something that we have followed and something we can certainly incorporate in our oversight and update you on. We can ask the College Savings Plan to update you in July, and then we do a biannual oversight report, so we can certainly incorporate that into our oversight as well.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've received just a couple of notes of sort of comparison of them possibly being higher compared to where the market is now. So that would be helpful information. Thank you.
Thank you. Did I hear someone else with a question? If not, we go ahead.
Great. It's my place. Okay, Mr. Chairman, I will just briefly go over the fiscal analysis services that we provide for the General Assembly. We provide several annual reports related to the state's finances, which are listed here, and Ella Miller and Nick Galvin lead the efforts for these reports. And JLARC also provides fiscal impact reviews. The most common are the second opinions on the fiscal impact of proposed legislation that we provide during the session. And just a reminder that these reviews must be requested by a committee chair. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my portion of the work plan, and I'm happy to take any further questions. And if there are none, I will turn the presentation back over to Hal to discuss the proposed calendar.
Thank you, Kimberly.
I'll go ahead.
The next slide just shows the proposed meeting schedule for 2021. Next month, we'll be presenting the findings from our review of international trade and transportation incentives. The next slide shows the studies that were passed by the General Assembly this year. There are studies of individual income tax progressivity, which Justin discussed earlier, the impact of the pandemic on K through 12 education, and the cost of K through 12 education and standards of quality. We've begun the income tax study and plan to begin the others later this year as we complete our 2021 work. With these studies already directed by the General Assembly, we have the capacity to take on 2 additional studies for 2022 that are directed by the Commission. Mr. Chairman, that concludes the presentation of the work plan. I'll be glad to take any final questions.
Questions back to Hal on the overall work plan. Well, it's appropriate then that we have a motion to approve the work plan. Is there a motion?
So move.
So moved by Senator Norman. Second?
Second. Second.
Second by Speaker Philcorn. All those in favor of approving the work plan as presented will say aye.
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 Opposed, no. Unanimous support. And let me just say again to the staff, looking forward to these. These are some very meaningful, exciting, timely studies. So we look forward to the outcome and for the work that you will lay out for us. Hal, I believe that finishes the JLARC portion of the report for today. We want to turn now to our Auditor of Public Accounts.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir. Senator Sproul.
before we do that,
Yeah.
At the last meeting, the probably recall, I raised a question about the harm practice of JLARC pertaining to blacks. And I noticed Al said we have hired 2 individuals for JLARC. And I want to know where are we, then I'm still questioning the same thing, of where are we as far as hiring blacks with JLARCs when we do a study for others, departments and other areas across the state. Right here at our own door, JLARCs have not hired blacks yet that I know of. I'm keep asking the same question over and over again. I have not gotten the answer yet.
Okay, sir. Director Greer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Sproul, we have hired 4 individuals to replace individuals that have left JLARC in the last several months. And I'm pleased to report that we have been able to hire 4 outstanding analysts. First and foremost, they're all terrific, have great educational and work experiences, and we're excited about all 4 analysts.
Are they black?
I'm also happy to report that it's a diverse group. 2 of the 4 are black individuals.
Praise the Lord. Thank you so much. I'm happy. Thank you, sir.
Absolutely.
Well, we certainly want Lionel to be happy.
I am. Thank you, my lawyer. Thank you, sir.
Thank you all. All right. So thank you, Hal and staff, for that. Stacy Henshaw. Are you with us?
Good morning, Chairman Plum, members. I appreciate the opportunity to come before you today to give you an update on some of our office's activities.
And Stacy, may I interrupt you just for a moment and say welcome to you. I believe this is your first presentation as the official state auditor. So welcome. You have a background of being with the state for some period of time with excellent service, and we're glad that you're taking over as the Auditor of Public Accounts. So thank you.
Thank you, and I'm honored to be in this role. So just to give you a brief overview of what we're covering today, I'm going to give you an office update, and some of that talks about the transition to me as auditor. I'm also going to, we're going to present our proposed work plan for fiscal year 2022, and we're going to cover a review of our prior year work results. So just to start off with an office update, we recently underwent peer review, and that review is conducted by the National State Auditors Association. And so the team consists of state audit staff from across the nation. And that review occurs every 3 years, and they basically want to make sure that we do quality work and follow the standards. The period that was covered was March 1st, 2020 through February 29th, 2021. And I'm pleased to report that we received the highest rating of pass on our work performed, and there were no deficiencies included in the report. And so I'm just really proud of our staff and our office for receiving that rating.
I might point out to the members of the commission that the letter granting us that highest level of review is in your packet that you have.
Yes, thank you. As Chairman Plum mentioned, I took over as the Auditor of Public Accounts on February 1st, and I saw that as an opportunity to take a look at our organization. And we've made a few changes that we think will help provide focus on areas that are evolving in the profession and really essential to us in continuing to meet our mission. And the first item I'm going to talk about is that we've made we've combined 2 of our specialty teams, existing specialty teams. We took our IT project management specialty team and our strategic risk management specialty team and combined them into one team, the strategic risk and project management team. And both of those teams dealt with risk, evaluating risk in the Commonwealth. And so one was looking more at financial risk and the other was looking at IT project management risk. And so we thought that it would help provide a comprehensive overview of the complete risk for particular agencies. And so with that, by combining those teams, I went from three directors combined for the two teams to 2 directors. And I took that extra director position and turned it into another deputy position. And so I now have 2 deputy positions. We found that there's been a lot of additional standards and there's a lot more technical review that's required at the director level. And so this is going to help us better focus on those core areas that we have as deputy. But it also is going to allow us to champion 2 specific areas that are just very key to our office. And so I now have a deputy auditor for human capital and operations and a deputy auditor for technology and innovation. And so I promoted 2 of my existing directors into those roles. And so today they're going to come and give you an overview of their new roles and some updates in their particular areas. And so LaToya Jordan is my new director, deputy auditor for human capital and operations, and Eric Sandridge is my new deputy auditor for technology and innovation. And I'm going to turn it over to the 2 of them now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stacy, and good morning, members. Thank you. So again, thank you. I appreciate that. So again, I am LaToya Jordan, and I have about close to 16 years experience with the Commonwealth of Virginia, 13 of which have been with the Auditor of Public Accounts. For the past 8 years, I have been an audit director, having primary oversight over the Commonwealth's annual financial report audit. I am extremely excited to transition into the role of Deputy Auditor for Human Capital and Operations. You know, one of the things that we realize is that our greatest resource in being able to fulfill our mission is our staff. So Stacy created this deputy role specifically to champion our efforts in staff recruitment, development, and overall engagement. So we believe that having a dedicated resource to lead our efforts in recruiting qualified individuals to ensure that our internal knowledge programs are reflective of the standards that we follow, as well as reflect our continued awareness of changes in the accounting and auditing industry. I plan on working hand in hand with our management team and human resources to ensure that we have staff engagement at all levels of employment at APA. I will also oversee certain back office operational activities, as well as look for opportunities to enhance our staff compensation structure. One of the things we did want to point out to you all this morning is that we recently received Top Workplace Award here in the Metro Richmond area. This is issued by the Richmond Times-Dispatch. This is the 8th consecutive year that we have received this recognition, and we are extremely proud of the fact that we are only one of 9 entities to receive this award since the program began. So I want to shift our conversation now to our staffing levels. You know, our goal is to always staff to our approved staff level, but we realize that it's absolutely critical that we maintain stable staffing levels in order to complete our required work. If you look back over the past 3 years, we do have an average turnover rate of about 18.6%, with 2020 being the highest at about 21.2%. So while the graph depicts our staffing levels have remained somewhat consistent over the past few years, we do continue to experience turnover of our experienced staff. And so some of that stability you see in our staffing levels over the past few years really reflect some of the new hires that we have brought on board. And so the level of work productivity that we are able to receive from a new hire obviously isn't at the same level that we would be able to from an experienced staff. And we do realize that, you know, some turnover is common in our profession, but we are tasked with the additional hurdle of losing our staff to local CPA firms, as well as some of the state agencies that we audit. So to help assist with our recruitment and retention efforts, We are extremely happy that in the recently approved Appropriation Act that we did receive an additional general fund appropriation of about $325,000 to implement some changes in our organization and compensation structure. These adjustments will provide us with a great opportunity to increase our starting salary, which will hopefully make us more competitive when we are out there recruiting, which we do on a continual basis here. It will also provide us with an additional promotional opportunity between the role of associate auditor to auditor. And it will also allow us to further incentivize and compensate when our staff become licensed CPAs here in the Commonwealth. We are in the process now of pulling together this formal proposal and submitting it to joint rules for their approval. And once we receive that approval, we will be extremely happy to move forward and implement these changes. So the last thing I wanted to point out before I turn it over to Eric is just our current salary scales. These are included in your packet for your approval today. They do reflect the 5% increase that's included in the approved budget for all state employees, and it will be effective June 10th, 2021. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Eric Sandridge.
Eric, welcome.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Chairman Plum and members of the commission. As Stacy introduced me earlier, my name is Eric Sandridge. I am serving and proud to serve as Stacy's new Deputy Auditor for Technology and Innovation. I have spent the last almost 9 years as our Audit Director for Higher Education Programs. So most of my work over that time has been working with our institutions of higher education. But I think this new role is very timely for our office. Certainly, technology is being used in many different ways. And one of the things that we want to do in this new role is to piggyback off of our upcoming strategic plan, which is designed to focus on the future of audit and innovation in the profession. My primary responsibilities as I start my work in this new role, in addition to general technical oversight over our audits, is to collaborate with our audit teams and our directors on various cross-cutting innovative audit approaches that we can apply throughout the audits of our agencies in the Commonwealth, to implement new technologies and do post-implementation assessments over those technologies, to develop efficient and effective audit approaches, and to analyze large data sets for important facts and circumstances that drive our audit work. We'll also be taking a look at our current reporting methods, our APA website, and other mechanisms for reporting our audit work and making sure that it is reaching the constituents who rely on it, and also collaborating with our data analysis team on the Commonwealth Data Point Transparency website that we run off of the APA website. I mentioned our strategic plan. We started this process prior to Martha's retirement. So this is our strategic plan for the years 2020 to 25. And in that process, we really wanted to focus on digital transformation of the APA services. There's been a lot of focus in recent years on the power of personal computing. Laptops can do a lot more than they once could, including machine learning and artificial intelligence and certain other services. And so we want to look at how that might impact our work in the government space, and also the future of the auditing profession as a whole. We've engaged a consultant, Enterprise Technologies LLC, and they're somewhat unique in our industry. They are a strategic planning consultant, but they're also CPAs. So they have some insight into the work that we do and how we want to do our work. And so we are leveraging them to assist us as we move through defining our upcoming plan. On this slide, you'll just see a timeline of our progress. So we're currently in that middle bullet, which is our vision and strategy development. We spent the fall defining our current business landscape, including doing some innovation awareness training for our staff. Now we're developing our overall strategy and our vision of what opportunities lie ahead. And soon we'll begin to focus our efforts with focus groups of our staff and our directors to really hone in on what we want those strategic planning goals to be for this upcoming strategic plan. We recognize that innovation can be both technological and process-based in the government setting. So we really want to look at all things, not only the technological innovation, but also how we staff our audits, our work plan, organizational structure, reporting, anything that we can do to make our office as efficient and effective as it can be. And as I mentioned, we spent the fall moving through that current state, that business landscape. And so now we're currently in our vision and strategy planning, this future state. Once we get through that, we'll do a gap analysis to see what opportunities exist from where we'd like to go compared to where we are now, and then define some progress metrics that we can look at as we move through our strategic plan to ensure we're accomplishing what we intend to accomplish. With that, I'd like to turn it back over to Stacy, who is going to discuss our proposed 2022 work plan.
And Stacy, before you get underway, let me ask if there are any questions that anybody has up to this point. Oh, hearing none, Stacy, go forward.
Thank you. So the work that we're proposing today is work that we'll be performing primarily during fiscal year 2022. And the majority of our work, our major focus is on the state's financial statements, the single audit of federal funds, and mandatory projects. And then with the remaining time that we have, we use risk factors to determine what additional work to perform. One thing I wanted to cover briefly before I move on is that the state's financial statements used to be referred to as the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report. That is the Gatsby definition of it. And at some point this year, Gatsby was notified that the acronym for that report was a term that's a derogatory term. It sounded like a derogatory term in another country. And so that report has been renamed as the Annual Comprehensive Financial Report. So when you hear us say ACFR now, that's the new acronym for the state's financial statements. And so just if you hear that mentioned today, because acronyms are something that we use a lot in government. And so if you hear us reference that is the new term referencing the governmental financial statements. We're proposing approximately 148,000 hours in this year's work plan, and that's about a 2,500 hour increase over the prior work plan. And those hours are really spread out. We have increases in some areas and decreases in other areas. And I'm going to go over these in more detail. And I just want to say you have in your packet a work plan report that has detail on all the agencies and the hours we're spending at the various agencies. This slide shows the hours we're proposing by function, and LaToya is going to cover special projects in a few minutes, so I'm not going to talk about them, and I'm going to cover executive departments and cycled agencies. And so I'll briefly touch on independent agencies and judicial and local government here. And so for independent agencies, this is work that we're doing primarily at the retirement system and the lottery. And those hours have remained pretty consistent this year from the prior year. For judicial and local governments, we are, this is the work that we do to prepare the comparative report of local governments, to audit state funds collected at the local level, and to audit the Commonwealth's court system. And we have about a 3,300 hour decrease in this area this year. And this is us somewhat right-sizing our budget as we've come up, like Eric talked, we're constantly looking for ways to be more efficient in the work that we do. And so we're using data more for those projects, and we're able to cut some time off of them. And in addition, we've been able to transfer some of those projects to ICQ or internal control questionnaire projects, and they have a lesser scope than full audits, and typically what determines whether it's an ICQ audit or a full audit is the risk associated. This slide is really just demonstrating that the bulk of the work that we do is in the executive branch, and this has gone up over the past few years. And so now about 80% of the work that we do is in the executive branch area. We have the only areas where we really have a lot of flexibility, and it's not mandated, is in our cycled agencies and in special projects. And that's about 10% of our hours. And a lot of our special projects are mandated special projects. So like I said, executive branch is where we spend the bulk of our time. We're proposing approximately 107,000 hours for that, and that's about 5,300 hours higher than the prior year. And really all of this additional hours is related to work we're doing over federal funds, and the bulk of that is over funds the Commonwealth's received for COVID-19 related relief. And it's spread out in different areas and different programs. And I am going to give an update on the work we've done related to COVID-19 funding later in the presentation. And so you'll see a breakout of the programs where we're proposing the work for this year. As you can see, we spend a lot of time, approximately over half of our time on the audit of higher education institutions in the Commonwealth. We do full financial statement audits over all of the four-year institutions, and then a combined report for the community college system. We also have work in that area related to NCAAs and also federal programs. And this year, there's about a 2,700 hour increase in that area. And that is related to student financial aid being in cycle for this year, federal program, and then also some work with the Education Stabilization Fund, which is a COVID relief program. And the other areas that I'm going to talk about is finance and health and human resources, and that's about 35,000 of our work plan hours. And the work there is primarily supporting the Act for Audit and the single audit of federal funds. We have about a 3,000 hour increase there. And once again, that's related to COVID-19 related relief programs that we're required to audit. One thing I will mention in the finance area is that includes our audit of the Department of Taxation. And just recently, Speaker Philicorn and Delegate Mugler had contacted our office and made us aware of a House Joint Resolution 536, a study that was being proposed and during the last session, and it was determined that it would be best, that didn't move forward, it was determined it'd be best to ask our office if we could look into that areas, and it's dealing with remote sales and use tax. And we already do work in that area, and so we have modified our procedures that we're going to do, or plan on modifying those procedures to cover the objectives of that study. The last thing I'm going to cover before I turn it over to LaToya is cycled agencies. And this is a group of about 70 agencies that there's no mandatory annual audit requirement for those agencies. And they generally don't have activity that's sufficient enough to need to be audited for the Act for single audit of federal funds. And 5 years ago, we came up with a new process to address those agencies to make sure that we're covering where the risk is, and also actually touching base with them at least once every 3 years. And so this slide summarizes that process. And so we have two pools, and the pools are based on risk. And so really the nature of the work we do at those agencies depend on where they fall in the risk cycle. And we have a lot of information on this process and the agencies that are covered under this process on pages 9 and 10 of the work plan report. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail of that today. And so at this point, I'm going to turn it over to LaToya again to talk about special projects.
So moving on to special projects, we do have 3 categories of special projects included in our work plan. Those that are mandated by legislation, statute, or the Appropriation Act, those that we determine using a risk-based approach, and then lastly, new this year is a special project related to a JLARC recommendation. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the first category of special projects, just because you've seen them before. These are recurring for our office, such as the Commonwealth Data Point. Those are the hours that we set aside to maintain the Commonwealth's transparency website. I'm sure you all are familiar with that. The local government fiscal distress analysis that we've been performing for a few years now. And Stacey's going to talk a little bit more about what goes into that analysis. So I'm just going to keep moving on. Our APA annual report is also included in this category of special projects, and that's where we summarize all the results of all the audits and other activities we perform throughout the year. Our next category of special projects, those that we determine using a risk-based approach. You see monitoring activities listed there related to capital projects and fraud. we deem those areas to be higher risk. And so we spend some time making sure that we are monitoring those areas sufficiently. Statewide analysis of Cardinal, that's the time that we spend assessing and testing statewide controls within the system and also the related business rules that are embedded in the system. We also extract the statewide data and develop queries and exception reports, and we can use this information to assist us when we're out there conducting our agency audits. We've also last year and still moving forward into this year, we'll continue to monitor the development of the human capital management module, which during the JLARC presentation, they mentioned that that is set to be implemented in fiscal 2022. Also in this category, you see some of the periodic reports that we issue, for instance, the comparative report for higher education institutions, as well as when we issue progress reports on selected systems development projects that are going on in the Commonwealth. The last item there I did want to touch on is review system implementation for Gatsby 87. This is a significant accounting standard that will be effective starting fiscal 2022. And essentially what it is doing is changing the way that we report and reflect leases on our financial statements. So if you look at what we reported as operating leases in our fiscal 20 ACFR, which was about $485.7 million, this was not reflected as a liability on the financial statements, but beginning in fiscal 22, under this new standard, this will be a new lease liability on the financial statements. So our office has been working with the Department of Accounts and the Department of General Services, looking at the system implementation changes that they've been making, and just making sure that we in the Commonwealth are prepared to implement this new standard. The last special project that I just want to touch on is the result of a recommendation that came from JLARC's 2019 Virginia's Workers' Compensation System and Disease Presumptions Report. And essentially, since we are already doing an annual audit at the Department of Human Resource Management, as well as the Virginia retirement system, it does make sense for us to dig a little deeper and look at the areas related to the payment of wage replacement benefits when there is an injury on the job. And so we do plan on developing some objectives this year and hopefully identify opportunities for the agencies to better coordinate when there are payments between these two programs. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Stacy, but do we have any questions?
Any questions? Senator McPike. Senator McPike, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one quick question. Do we have any visibility to the implementation of Gatsby 34, the standard on capital depreciation and facility depreciation in the localities?
I might defer to Stacy on that one. Hold on. And so 34 was actually a standard that the Commonwealth in its localities implemented 2002. And at that point in time, we worked with localities a lot in terms of helping them to work through depreciation. Now, I will say there is a new standard. They're working on a replacement to Gatsby 34 right now, but depreciation will continue to be something that is a part of governmental accounting. Prior to Gatsby 34, governments did not depreciate their assets. And so it just, I'm not sure if that answered your question, but I know at the time that new standard was implemented, we ran focus groups for localities. And I was actually the person that went around and did a lot of presentations to help them with implementation.
Okay, that's helpful. Yeah, just wondering if we have any comparison or review of that implementation since that time. And it relates to school modernization and construction, for instance, and many other capital investments that the General Assembly is considering in the future. That's why I bring up that question.
Right. And with Gatsby 34, this was the first time that infrastructure was reported on the financial statements. And so we worked really closely with the Department of Transportation. There were questions about who owned the roads. Did localities own them? Did the state own them? And we worked through a lot of issues with that. And I would be happy if there's specific information that that you wanted to discuss. We can pull together any, like I said, we have a whole lot of detail back from that time. but it has been in place for a while now. There were times when implementation first occurred that when we would go out and do quality control reviews at the local level over their financial statements, we would notice issues with that. But by and far now, it seems like localities have embraced that and have been able to report that information in their financial statements.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Okay, Stacy, go ahead.
At this point in time, since we've reached the point where we've presented to you anything that we needed approval on, we thought it would be good, just in case we lost some members while we're discussing our prior work plan results, that we would request approval of our proposed 2022 work plan and approval of the salary scales that LaToya discussed earlier. That is the 5% increase. That's a statewide increase.
Okay, you're not suggesting that this further report is going to be somehow boring and we might tune out, are you?
No, absolutely not.
Well, okay, commission members, we have the proposed work plan along with the approved, with the salary scales. I would ask for a motion that these work plan and salary scales be approved. Do I have such a motion?
So move, Mr. Chairman.
So moved.
Okay, it's been moved by Senator Spruill and seconded by Delegate Carr that the plans be approved. All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Hearing none, then your two items are approved. Now go ahead with your most entertaining part of your report.
I was just worried that once we started talking about this, that you would forget the other information, since it was going to be. And so the first area that I'm going to cover today is local government. And we published a draft of our 2020 comparative report of local government on February 15th, which is the deadline that's established by the code. And this was the first year there was a change in the deadline. It went from February 1st to February 15th. And at the time that we published it on our website, we had 20 localities that have not reported data to us to be reported in that report. Those delays that we have impact our ability to finalize the draft. And so we just finalized it at the end of last week. And just to give you some perspective, when I was preparing these slides last week on Tuesday, I had that we were missing data for 6 localities. And so we had 1 locality come in. And then we actually had a locality come in on Thursday, and that's Colonial Beach. And so now the report that we published at the end of last week was missing 5 localities, and that's the cities of Emporia and Hopewell, and the counties of Bedford and Lee, and the town of Rocky Mount. And so once we receive their information, we will amend the version that we have on our website.
Stacey, I don't know how many people look at that comparative report, but I do have on occasions used it, and the data in it is a gold mine full of data on local government as well as state government. So I highly recommend it. And like I say, I do use it.
I appreciate that. And we get a lot of comments that people use that extensively. And so this just gives a summary here of the submissions from 18 for the past 3 years. And like I said, our deadline for reporting that went from February 1st to February 15th, and the localities got 2 extra weeks to provide information to us. And so that went from November 30th to December 15th. And as you can see, that resulted in more localities meeting the initial deadline. And especially given the COVID-19 environment, that we saw that as a positive trend, that we had so many that were in by December 15th in the deadline. And so this slide is not updated so right now we have 5 pending since Colonial Beach had come in. And as you can see, we still have 1 pending for 18 and 19, and that's the city of Hopewell. And so they have yet to submit their financial information to us from 18, 19, or 20. So staying in the local government area, just an update of where we are with our local fiscal distress monitoring model. That model was created during the 2017 Virginia General Assembly session, and we started out and issued our first report. And in that report, we used something called the financial assessment model, which was a ranking methodology for the localities. When we went to our second year, we refined our model, and our current model now individually analyzes each locality's financial ratios, and we assign points to localities based on the performance results of each ratio. And the higher number of points that a locality receives means that they're showing weak or undesirable performance for that particular ratio. And we also incorporated a second assessment, and that assessment includes demographic information such as unemployment rate, poverty rate, population growth or decline, other qualitative factors and other external factors. For example, we utilized the Commission on Local Government's fiscal stress rankings on locality revenue capacity and effort as part of that second assessment. And once we've done our analysis, we basically have two ways that we can go, and one is that for a locality, we determine that there's no follow-up necessary. However, if the score is high enough that they've received, if the rank, the amount of points that they receive is high enough, then we will reach out to them and ask if they would want to participate in additional follow-up. And that additional follow-up includes completing a financial questionnaire and having us have some conversations with their leadership. We released our third report in April of 2020, and no new localities were identified as a result of our 2019 analysis. So our fiscal year 2019 was the report that we, our 2019 analysis was the report that we issued in April 2020. And as a result of that analysis, we determined that the city of Bristol no longer was designated in a situation of fiscal distress due to their continued improvements with their ratios. And so we're currently finalizing our fiscal year 19 and 20 ratio analysis, and we're going to do a combined report on that later this year. And we have identified the city of Buena Vista due to as being in a situation of fiscal distress due to significant downward trends in their fiscal year 19 and fiscal year 20 ratios. And we have contacted them as of last week to determine whether or not they want to continue the process and complete the questionnaire and meet with our office regarding their results. The city of Hopewell is again qualitatively identified as potentially being in a situation of fiscal distress, and that's just the result of their continued delays in providing financial information to our office. And one of the things that we're doing with this fiscal distress monitoring is also monitoring the impact of COVID-19 on localities. And so we're looking at existing ratios, focusing on those that measure available reserves and sufficiencies of revenues. And we're also looking at COVID-19 related expenses that are relative to federal aid that localities have received. And we have incorporated the Commission of Local Government's July 2020 local vulnerability analysis into our analysis. And that report analyzes other indicators in addition to their normal fiscal stress index to identify locality specific impact from COVID-19. And we're just monitoring locality specific information and qualitative factors on a case-by-case basis. Our office does participate in a national work group that centers around local fiscal distress. And so that's a great work group for getting information and utilizing it in our monitoring process. And so at this time, I didn't know if there were any questions over our locality related reports.
Any questions? Stacey, just very quickly, and I don't want you to go into a whole lot of detail, but the difference between what the Commission on Local Government does with fiscal stress and what you do with your, and again, I've lost a difference in the terms, but it seems like you both are doing kind of an analysis of fiscal stress.
We are, but we're just using different ratios. And so ours is looking at the financial statement ratios. And so we're actually pulling that information off of their financial statements and working in, but we do work closely with them and their data and utilize their analysis when we're performing our analysis.
Well, does either or both those reports provide a way in which looking at funding for public education, for example, and it costs the composite index get involved in there at all?
I would say that it's not, so it does, we don't have a specific indicator related ratio that we're looking at that's related to education. It's more of a combined ratio that would have all of their expenses in there. The comparative report would have information by function, and so you could see more specific details about where localities spend their money. And so that might be a better indicator of information and how a locality compares to other localities.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, go ahead.
And I'm going to move on now to the results of our audit of the state's financial statements and our single audit of federal funds. We had 92 total findings related to those two audits this year, and that is a decrease of 16 findings from the prior year. This slide shows the agencies with the most significant findings, and you'll see Department of Behavioral Health had the most at 16, Social Services had 14, the Department of Health and DMAS each had 10. And one thing that I'll say about the behavioral health findings is that they had a decrease of 10 from the previous year, but part of that decrease was because we combined some similar findings into one finding, into single findings this year. So for example, if they had access control findings with multiple systems, we reported them separately last year and we've combined them this year. So it may be a little bit misleading in terms of that decrease. We had 7 material weaknesses this year, and that's the most significant type of the most severe finding. We had 2 at DMAS and then 1 each at VDOT, DSS, VEC, Health, and Behavioral Health. And the behavioral health finding actually resulted in us qualifying a federal program that we audited for them for this year. Typically, we divide our issues that we note into IT issues and non-IT issues. IT issues continue to remain the biggest issues that we find when we're doing audits. So I have a separate slide there on that. But this just demonstrates the non-IT issues that we had. And this year, the biggest area was related to federal grants management and federal awards and question costs. And so we had 21 findings in that area. And then we had 13 findings related to financial accounting and reporting and 10 findings related to human resources and payroll. And this slide shows our IT issues, and they're broken out by control family. And so a single finding can have multiple control families. And so if you try to do the math on number of findings, it's not going to add up. But, you know, for example, one finding can cover access control and contingency planning. And so as in the past, access typically results in the most findings that we have for our audits. And sticking with our audits of federal funds, one of the things I wanted to do today is to talk to you about the increase in audit effort as a result of federal COVID funding. And so in the past year, from between fiscal year 19 and fiscal year 20, the Commonwealth's federal expenses increased 58%. And so they went from 14.7 billion to 23.3 billion. And a lot of that additional funding was in existing programs that we already were auditing, but we did have 3 programs that required additional funding. And that was the unemployment insurance program at VEC, the coronavirus relief fund, and the education stabilization fund. And I'm going to talk about each of those briefly. With unemployment insurance, because they had program changes and had to change their internal controls related to the additional funding that was flowing through there, we had to audit them as a major program in 2020, even though we had just audited them as a major program in 2019. And so typically you would audit that program once every 3 years. We had 3 audit findings for unemployment insurance, and one of those was a material weakness. And so that took us about 400 additional hours, or a 21% increase for that audit. And because of the funding that continues to flow through, we will be required to audit them again for 2021. And one thing I just want to mention about those numbers I gave you a little while ago and the increase in federal expenses is that really was for a very small portion of fiscal year 2020, because those funds didn't start flowing down to the Commonwealth till we were almost at the end of fiscal year 20. And so that was a point that I just wanted to make sure that I got across, because this year is going to, for 2021, is going to be more significant. The Coronavirus Relief Fund was a new program for the Commonwealth, and it had expenses that exceeded the threshold. For us, we measure expenses through June 30th, and that's what determines whether or not something comes into cycle as a major program. So that resulted in about 250 additional hours, and that work was centered at the Department of Accounts and Emergency Management. And a lot of that work was it was about $650 million that was awarded to local governments as a result of that. And so we will have to audit this program again this coming up year, because once again, there's been some changes in it, and more agencies have received those funds during the year. So we anticipate that we'll have to spend about 1,100 hours auditing that program in the coming year, and that work will be done at 7 different agencies. And then the Education Stabilization Fund, this was another new program, and the expenses exceeded the threshold. So we had to audit it as a major program, and we spent about 700 hours doing that work, and that was covered at 11 different higher education institutions. And once again, that that program has significant expenses this year, and so we will have to audit it again for 2021. And really, that's one, because money is still being spent that we're not sure what the impact is going to be in the coming year. And so it really depends on how the funds are dispersed in the Commonwealth. Because of all of this new money and the new changes and the new regulations regarding it, we've had to do a lot in our office to make sure that we're staying current on new requirements or changing requirements. And up until we were finishing audit work, guidance was coming from the federal government in terms of the regulations that the agencies receiving these funds had to follow. And so our office worked with the National State Auditors Association to establish 3 different weekly information sharing calls over the 3 programs I discussed. And people from our office, staff in our office, helped lead those calls. We had one of our directors is on the AICPA Government Audit Quality Executive Committee, and they've changed their meeting schedule from monthly to weekly to discuss issues related to COVID-19 programs. And our office has also been working with the Association of Government Accountants to establish a work group to look at how the federal government could provide better guidance to recipients and auditors, and in a more timely manner. And so the work plan that you just approved, I mentioned earlier, it has 4,800 additional hours related to COVID-19. And these are the programs that are covered in that 4,800 hours. And like I said, there's other programs the Commonwealth has that's received funding, like Medicaid through that's COVID-19 related, but we always audit that program every year. So we didn't count that as additional hours because we were already going to be there. So this is not all the effort that by any means that we're spending related to COVID-19, but this is the additional effort that our office is spending. And so it really is a significant, from our staffing level perspective, especially the time frame we have to do this work, that it is a significant level of additional effort. One thing I want, because we've received questions in our office about this, is the American Rescue Plan Act. And so I wanted to point out that we have 1,400 hours in our work plan related to that as a reserve. And the reason for that is that right now that there are some unknowns with it. It's a new program. There are multiple new programs under that act. And right now, there's a lot of funds that are going to be flowing, but it really depends on when the Commonwealth receives those funds and spends them. And because from an audit perspective, it's the spending of the funds that drives when we need to audit it. And so this could result in additional hours. It could be that we don't need the entire 1,400, or it could be that we need more than 1,400. And so we're monitoring that on a daily basis to look to see if additional programs are going to come in that we need to audit. And at this point, I don't know if there were any questions for me before I'll turn it over to Eric to wrap it up with our higher education results.
Eric, if you could wrap it up briefly, we would be most appreciative.
Thank you, Stacy, and as requested, and I will do this very briefly. We had two institutions where we saw material weaknesses related to fiscal 19 audits, where we haven't quite finished the fiscal 20 audits as of today. We had two of those material weaknesses at Longwood University and one at Virginia State. And then across the other institutions you can see on the slide, we found 63 significant deficiencies. Those are those items that are less significant than a material weakness, but still important for you all to be aware of. With regard to material weaknesses, Longwood is still working to address prior year material weaknesses. So you'll see that these are either repeat or partial repeat recommendations related to financial reporting processes and also strengthening their internal controls over capital assets. The recommendation at Virginia State University is a new issue for fiscal 19 related to matching federal grants with qualifying state expenses. They had some disallowed costs related to a federal grant program that required them to book a liability on their financial statements. So they're working to address that to come into compliance with the federal requirements. Similar to the results of our state agencies, information systems security is the #1 area that we have findings for our higher education institutions. Similarly, you'll see that HR, payroll, and benefits and federal compliance are also top finding areas where there is compliance-heavy requirements that drive some of what we see in those areas. I quickly wanted to mention that we also issue a report each year since this legislation came out related to compliance on the NCAA subsidy percentage requirements. We have one institution that was non-compliant for the report as of June 30th, 2019. That was Norfolk State. I should mention they were barely non-compliant and that they were about 0.6% over the threshold. But I know they're working on coming up with a plan, if they haven't already submitted it, to come into compliance. And related to that, we also pointed out in our report for fiscal 19 that we believe many institutions would have significant difficulty in meeting the requirements of subsection D of that code section relating to how they generate additional revenue in athletics, and that it should be greater than or equal to the change in student-related revenue that athletics is receiving. And so the General Assembly did pass some flexibility in Chapter 552 related to how we analyze the change in generated revenue for the next 3 fiscal years, 2021 and 22. So I know the institutions are appreciative of that flexibility. With that, we will take any questions that you have and really do appreciate you listening to our presentation this morning.
Well, thank you very much, Stacy and staff. Do members have questions? I want you to understand that we recognize the critical importance of the work that you do. Our lack of questions reflect the fact that we know we're in good hands with the professional work that you do and the comprehensiveness with which you do it. I think we can all feel a little better about how state government operates with you all having your finger on the trigger. So,
thank you. We appreciate that.
any other questions or comments? Any other business to come before the commission? Hearing then, do we have a motion for adjournment?
Move to adjourn.
Senator McPike moves that we adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
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 Have a good month, and we will see you next month. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Good job. He does a good job.